So thank you for inviting me to the OSU Think Tank. I'm excited to be here today. And I want to talk to you a little bit about universal design for learning and the state of the research. I understand from Jessica that not everybody here is necessarily very familiar with UDL, so I want to start with a very brief overview of what UDL is. Universal Design for Learning is a set of principles for curriculum development that give all individuals equitable opportunities to learn and express their learning. It draws from along about 15-20 years now of neuroscience, cognitive science, and other fields of research in which we have come to understand how people learn. And as we have mapped out the brain and figured out these different neural networks related to learning, what we've been able to distill down to is basically three major networks. What in UDL we refer to as the affective network, the recognition network, and the strategic network, which each deal with different aspects of how people learn. For example, the affective network deals with how learners get engaged and stay motivated, how they're challenged, excited, or interested. And the recognition network is more about how we gather information and make sense of things, whereas the strategic network is how we perform, how we make decisions, strategize, express ourselves, etc. And all this leads to these three major principles of developing learning experiences that are effective is we need to stimulate interest for motivation for learning, present information in different ways, and differentiate how students express what they know. So to do this, we often talk about providing multiple or flexible means of engagement, means of representation, means of action and expression. Now, UDL is actually mentioned frequently in higher education policy, including the National Education Technology Plan, the Higher Education Opportunities Act, and the National Instructional Materials Accessibility Standards of 2006, which is part of IDEA. So despite the fact that UDL has been mentioned frequently and it has been demonstrated, according to some, to be very effective in K-12 and higher education environments, it's not necessarily particularly well known or well practiced or even well researched. And that's what I want to focus on here. Some researchers have argued that to date, UDL has not really been researched very much or at all. But this point is contested. For example, if you look over at the UDL, National Center on UDL, they say that the UDL guidelines are based on research from several very different fields and from many different researchers at many different universities and different research organizations. That research has been reviewed, compiled, and organized by educators and researchers at CAST, that's the Center for Applied Special Technology. The process spanned a 10-year period and involved several different stages. So this sounds extremely research-based. And so on the one hand, you have a lot of researchers saying, we haven't researched UDL, and on the other hand, we have CAST saying it's been extremely well researched. What I've come to conclude is that UDL is most definitely based on research, but it is not research-based. Let me show you that again. It's based on research, but it is not research-based. What do I mean by that? Well, if you look at the UDL guidelines, which I'm representing here in their 3.0 form, there are these three principles at the top that we talked about. There are the 9 guidelines, which are represented by those bolded titles in the gray boxes, and there are 31 checkpoints. Now, if you look on the UDL Center's website, you can find references that demonstrate every single one of these 31 checkpoints is extremely well researched, has been determined to be a research-based practice, an effective practice in education. What UDL is doing is not coming up with new methods. It's organizing a framework for how we design around methods that we already know to be effective. In this sense, UDL is a gestalt. For example, a couple years ago at the UDL IRN Summit, Alyssa Laurie said, UDL is more than the checkpoints, more than the guidelines, and even the principles. It is a design framework. And I agree with this. So do a lot of people in the field. But it raises the question, how can we operationalize and thereby measure or research something that is inherently dynamic? Effectively in UDL, you're not constrained to a certain number of checkpoints. You're certainly not expected to use all 31 checkpoints in your design, or necessarily even all 3 principles in a certain lesson. So who gets to decide which checkpoints, from which principles, how do I make those decisions? How many do I need To what extent does it have to be routine, or can it be specified for a specific learning environment? These are questions that are very much open and intentionally open in the practice of UDL. We're not trying to nail it down. As soon as you pin UDL down and say you need 2 checkpoints from all 3 principles, it ceases to be UDL because it removes the design capacity from the instructor's hands. We don't think that that's reasonable. Now, this question has been being discussed recently in the last couple of years, and I think has led to had some influence on research that's emerging at the cutting edge. For example, Dean, Leepost, and Hapke set out to enhance traditional lecture with UDL design instruction in a lecture hall. I think this is a really fascinating topic. They found what they were defining to be UDL to be effective, but I'm wondering, despite the apparent intention, the methods in this paper were reduced to the utilization of instructional tools, not instructional design. So effectively, they brought it down to these 3 specific opportunity to respond tools that they used, clickers and a couple others, and they saw students had preference for expressing themselves with these different tools, and they got more things out of the class and so forth, and that's wonderful. And I think it's a great paper for demonstrating how providing opportunities to respond is great. But it's worth questioning, are the results because of the UDL design or because of the instructional tools employed? If UDL is more than the sum of its parts, then what we have here is an examination of how the parts of UDL are effective, but not necessarily the design framework. We're back to the issue that UDL is more than the sum of its parts, and that makes it much more difficult to evaluate as effective. So we need to begin, as we look forward in the research and both what we're reading and what we're writing, I think we need to view UDL as a design process, not a method. So Basham, Smith, and Satter in 2016, for example, talked about it as a 5-step process, and I think this is more clearly iterative of the UDL framework. They talked about establishing clear outcomes. What are the students going to know or be able to do by the end of this lesson? Anticipate learner variability, design assessments, and design instructional experiences that address that learner variability and allow them to achieve the outcomes. Then you deliver that instruction and you reflect on what you might want to do differently next time. That entire thing is the UDL process. But in research like the one that we were looking at a moment ago, we focus too narrowly on what we traditionally would look at in instruction in education research, which is the instructional experience, the methods or the materials that were used, and then how that affected the delivery and the response of the students. That's far too narrow of a scope for when we're saying that we're researching UDL. Because UDL is this entire thing, we've got to be able to look at the entire scope and sequence of the design and delivery process to both define and measure UDL. So this certainly affects how we define and measure UDL. Now, last year at the UDL IRN Summit, I presented on this topic in which I was talked about capturing not compressing UDL, and I argued that the best way that we can define UDL, operationalize UDL, is from a postmodern framework rather than a modern framework, effectively defining it more clearly and explicitly by what it's not rather than what it is. So certainly we have this very broad definition of what it is, like we were just talking about. UDL is the proactive design of learning experiences through an explicit process of identifying high-level learning outcomes, identifying barriers, and addressing these barriers through quality assessment and learning experience design. That leaves a lot of flexibility in how one approaches the methods, the materials, etc. that they use to implement UDL, and that makes it difficult to operationalize. However, we can be very specific in some of these ways that we say something, as soon as you cross this line, is no longer UDL. So for example, if we're designing for a student with a disability and then fanning that out to everybody else, that's not UDL. That's accommodations and then expanding on accommodations. If it's some sort of a single method approach, this one size fits all sort of thing, it's not UDL. UDL is about a multiplicity or flexibility of approaches. If it is low technology or no technology, a lot of people in the field would say it's not UDL anymore. UDL's flexibility comes from harnessing the potential that technology provides us. It is certainly not assistive technology, etc. Most of these things that I'm drawing from here on what UDL is not are coming from a single paper, a 2010 paper by Dave Eddyburn called Would You Recognize It If You Saw 10 Propositions for UDL in the Next Decade? And he was exploring these propositions. Most of them were in the negative, and that's what I wanted to explicate, that we can actually use that to frame this. We're in discussions right now with several of the leaders in the field trying to clarify what exactly those blue boxes ought to be. This is just a draft form, but it represents where we're going right now and clearly defining the boundaries while allowing UDL itself to be flexible. So what should you be looking for as you look over quality research for UDL and as you maybe produce research related to UDL? What you want to be watching for is, does the lesson, does the intervention, the instruction being intervened have high-level learning outcomes? For example, there's some research out there that uses UDL to teach vocabulary. I and several others in the field would argue that's not a UDL lesson. Teaching vocabulary is very important, but it's a step towards something much larger. And so UDL, because it enables students from various diverse circumstances and backgrounds and current levels of skill and knowledge to grow, we expect them to be able to achieve some pretty great stuff within their development range. And so we want to see high-level learning outcomes there. We want to see an explication of the anticipated barriers. And so this isn't necessarily requiring the instructor or the researcher to know their students well. We talk about in UDL these systematic, predictable variability in the population. So I can anticipate, without even knowing a class roster, that there's going to be some students who might learn this particular material better if they got to see it and hear it, and others who really need to get their hands on it, and others who are going to be bored, and others who are going to be engaged naturally by the topic. Those kind of barriers I can anticipate before I even have a class roster, and I can begin addressing them proactively as well. That's what UDL does. You want to see a metacognition through the design process decisions. Because UDL occurs, for lack of a better word, throughout the design process, the delivery just explicates what has already been designed. You want to see in research papers of UDL, where were we going? What did I anticipate as far as barriers? How did I design assessment and or learning experiences that would address those anticipated barriers? And then what happened? Then that entire process becomes UDL. The specific methods they used are not just testing those methods, but testing those methods as a product of design, and therefore elevates us from reinforcing the checkpoints, which we already know that work, to a level of demonstrating that this design process is effective in bringing change to students. You want to be looking for them to use the UDL guidelines. Are they showing that they're offering multiple or flexible means of action and expression, engagement, and representation somehow? Not necessarily all three, depending on the scope of the research, but you want to see them drawing from the UDL framework and principles. What questions do you have for me?